right, Jeremiah 7. Indeed, God is amazing, and he doesn't need me to say it, but sometimes maybe I just need the reminder. Either way, let's call Jeremiah 7 den of robbers. Understanding that if this is not the source of the quote that Jesus used, describing the reason for clearing the temple when they had turned it into a place of merchandise, even though it was called to be a house of prayer for all peoples, it is a quote that is super similar to that part of Jesus's ministry. And because of that, I thought it'd be a good way to sum up what I think is going on in this chapter anyway, that begins with a call for Isaiah to go to the people. And in the first 3 verses, call them to hear and amend their ways, because if they do, it's going to go well with them. But it's going to caution them in verse 4 not to trust in deceptive words, that because this is the temple of the Lord, they are the people of the Lord, and they will be saved without regard to what they do. Verses 5 through 7 are going to say, no, for if you truly amend your ways, do justice, stop oppressing the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, you stop murdering the innocent and idolizing things that cannot save, then you will be saved. However, if you trust in deceptive words, it's not going to go good. So in verses 8 through 11, he is going to talk about the way in which they have repurposed his house into a place where they will be able to do all these things and essentially whatever they want to do, and then come and say, we are delivered. No, he's saying it's going to be quite the opposite, because at this point, they're not only doing that, but they're going out from their deliverance to repeat some of the very same shady things. And for that reason, he is giving them an example in verses 12 through 15. Go and see what he has already done to Shiloh and understand Shiloh's past is going to be their future. I'm going to guess that's destruction. I'd have to look it up to remember specifically, but in this chapter, he's using it as an illustration of past destruction that is once again going to repeat itself if they do not, as he said, amend their ways. As he's going to say, therefore you, seeming to speak to Isaiah, do not even pray for them. Why? Because have you not seen the things that they have been doing? Therefore, he's going to seem to say in verse 21, his anger is going to burn against them unquenched. Why? Because in verses 22 through 26, he's going to recall the way in which he gave them a simple command as he actually delivered them out of the land of Egypt, and that was to obey. But he added the laws of sacrifice and burnt offerings, seemingly because they refused to obey the simpler set of commandments that he gave them leaving the land of Egypt. And then likewise, he's going to say that he intervened, or what we would call, he gave them an intervention through the prophets, but they would not listen in verses 27 through 29, letting Jeremiah know that just as they did not listen to the prophets then, don't plan on them listening to you now. Instead, expect them to continue on in disobedience, hating discipline, and likewise hating truth until he finally brings the consequences that he has promised. Once again, symbolized in the way that he treated Shiloh, the way he's promising that that is going to be a picture of their future. Therefore, in verses 30 through the end of the chapter, verse 34, he's going to talk about the way in which they have turned what is now a, I guess, relatively famous place that we now call Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom, as they changed it into a place for sacrificing their own children. As we have heard before, with the measure we use, God will measure it back to us for the good and for the bad. He is now going to turn it into a place where he now slaughters them. The two things that stood out to me most in this chapter, quite possibly being a dominant theme and a sub-theme. The dominant theme being justice, thing that we have heard in many a chapter and many a book leading up to this point. And it's going to point forward to the way in which God himself is going to sum up what he has asked of his people then and quite possibly now. What has God asked of you except to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Once again, Jeremiah seems to be giving us a waypoint or a midpoint in the story in which God is going to sum up what he really wants out of his own mouth. He's telling them once again, one of the things that is going to mark his mercy is whether or not they are going to be merciful to one another by, in this case, at least showing justice in their decisions. Beyond that, the lesser theme is, as we mentioned in verses 22 through 26, the less he could trust them, the more restriction or the more laws he put on them, specifically saying he did not add the laws of sacrifice and burnt offering until they chose to repeatedly do things that were simply unhealthy for the life in the community of Israel as he was trying to establish them as a nation. And not just a nation, the greatest nation on earth, which, as we saw in the Kings and the Chronicles, they actually seem to become under the reign of Solomon, as quite possibly a picture of what God is creating in his church. Meaning, it's not just good enough for us to be a nation. He has called us to be a holy nation, understanding that there is coming a time when he is no longer going to deal with his people the way he deals with the people of Israel here in Jeremiah through laws and prophets, constantly begging them to do what's right. As we mentioned before, it's not heaven if he is constantly having to go through the stress of trying to get us to simply treat one another with respect. And yes, it does stress God, as the word specifically tells us not to grieve his Holy Spirit, a statement that quite possibly goes back to the way in which he contended with Israel over and over again from the time they left Egypt, now even through the time of Jeremiah, something Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 remind us of as a foundation for warning us that today, if we hear his voice, as we often say, don't harden your hearts. Why? Because it just flat out seems that he does not want to deal with the stress of trying to enforce a peace among us forever. And so Jeremiah chapter 7 may be yet another example of the way in which God grows tired of those he cannot trust to stop trying to repurpose his kingdom into something that it flat out isn't. As he seems to be moving from a time in which he is willing to contend with those who require more supervision and more laws to a time when he can enjoy being around a remnant that he can genuinely trust with fewer laws and more freedom.